When you think of sleep, what do you think about? Is it restfulness, rejuvenation, perhaps a chance to clear your mind of the day's events? You likely think of some combination of these things. But in some corners of the world, sleep can mean something entirely different. Imagine yourself to be living in a small village in the heart of Africa. On a hot day, you notice your neighbor, laid out under a tree, taking a mid-afternoon nap. To most, that might sound like a pleasant reprieve from a long day's work. But you know different. Over the last few weeks, he'd been complaining of fever, headaches, joint pains, and weakness. He had chalked it up to yet another bout of the all-too-common malaria. Several days ago, though, he had begun to act more irritable, nervous, and at times even confused. The night before, you had seen him up and about, wandering aimlessly around the village after everyone else had gone to sleep. Having seen this countless times before, you knew what comes next for your friend. Over the next several weeks, he will begin to grow more fatigued during the day, needing to take increasingly frequent naps. He will lose interest in his work, his hobbies, and even his family. He will participate less and less in conversations, preferring to stay by himself in his hut. Eventually, he will stop communicating altogether, and will even begin to lose interest in eating. By this point, he will, to all the world, appear to be just the shell of a person he was, sitting in his hut, staring blankly forward, unable to eat, talk, or even move. He will frequently fall into unarousable spells of sleep, only to wake back up into his same zombie-like state. Soon, however, he will fall into yet another sleep spell and never wake again. His illness has gone by dozens of names over the years in your region. To the rest of the world, however, it is known by one common name: African sleeping sickness. African sleeping sickness, now known in modern times as human African trypanosomiasis, has plagued sub-Saharan Africa for thousands of years. It has not only afflicted humans either, and is well known to be able to infect nearly all large animals. Native animals tend to only experience a mild illness, but livestock animals such as cattle, sheep, goats, and others more commonly experience the full-blown lethal version of the illness. The burden on livestock in this part of the world has been so severe, in fact, that modern scholars have even suggested this as one of the main reasons why large-scale agriculture never developed at levels seen in other parts of the world. While it has gone by a number of different names over the years, the Zulu people referred to the disease as Ngana, meaning powerless or useless. It was so common in sub-Saharan Africa that the people here became quite adept at spotting the disease, even in its very early stages. African sleeping sickness is caused by a small protozoal parasite known as Trypanosoma brucei. DNA analysis of this microbe suggests that it is likely one of the oldest diseases to plague humans, with its recognizable ancestors predating the dinosaurs by over 100 million years. It likely existed for most of its history as a gut parasite in a wide variety of insects. It was not until the evolution of the modern tsetse fly, approximately 35 million years ago, however, that Trypanosoma brucei was able to flex its full disease-causing potential. The tsetse fly are large biting flies, similar to the horsefly, endemic to much of tropical Africa. They're obligate parasites, feeding on the blood of nearly all vertebral animals. They've been known to transmit a number of other bloodborne illnesses, and for this reason will likely make a return in future episodes. As tsetse flies and Trypanosoma brucei have been present in Africa together for tens of millions of years, most of the native wildlife species have developed a tolerance to the parasite. They'll still become infected by the pathogen, but experience only a mild illness. Livestock animals, however, have only been present in Africa for the relatively short period of around 13,000 years, which has not been enough time for them to develop meaningful resistance, and the disease proves to be almost universally fatal in these animals, similar to humans. Interestingly though, there are a number of different species of trypanosoma which can cause variants of sleeping sickness. Humans, however, have been in Africa for hundreds of thousands of years and are resistant to most other species, except for Trypanosoma brucei. When ancient civilizations began to arise in Africa, they almost immediately had to contend with difficulties caused by sleeping sickness. Thousands of years ago, the northern coast of Africa held much more lush vegetation than it does today, providing a suitable environment for the tsetse fly in this region. The first evidence of humans having to deal with the consequences of this come from the Egyptians, who tended to keep their cattle mixed together with resistant native animals in an attempt to protect their cattle from the effects of sleeping sickness. The first ever written recording of the disease comes from a veterinary papyrus of the Kahun papyri, dating back to 2000 BC. This papyrus described a disease of cattle which closely resembles sleeping sickness. Impressively, the ancient Egyptians quickly figured out that this livestock disease was likely caused by the annoying tsetse flies, and recommended applying ointments made of bird fat to the livestock to prevent bites. Due to human agricultural activity, though, which modified the flow of the Nile River at that time, most of the breeding sites for the North African tsetse flies were destroyed, leading to a gradual recession of sleeping sickness from the area. Interestingly, Egyptians had also been attempting to breed horses for hundreds of years, but were largely unsuccessful until the near eradication of the tsetse fly from the area. For thousands of years, though, the written record was largely silent on sleeping sickness. It was not until the Arabian geographer Abu Abdallah Yaqut, on a journey to Africa to develop trade relations with several of the West African kingdoms around the year 1200 AD, came upon a village that had evidently been devastated by the disease. He reported that most of the inhabitants, and even their dogs, appeared to be severely emaciated and nearly comatose. Approximately 150 years later, an Arabian historian, Ibn Khaldun, wrote a report on the death of the Sultan Mari Jata, the Emperor of Mali. To quote, Jata had been smitten by the sleeping illness, a disease which frequently affected the inhabitants of the climate, especially the chieftains, who are habitually affected by the sleep. Those afflicted are virtually never awake or alert. The sickness harms the patient and continues until he perishes. Despite its presence in Africa for millions of years, European civilization did not become aware of sleeping sickness until the 1700s, near the peak of the European slave trade. The first to notice the alarming symptoms of the disease were, naturally, doctors who worked for the slave trade companies. As the disease had been interfering with their profits, slave traders instructed the doctors to investigate the disease. The first, Dr. John Atkins, published a detailed account of the late stages of the disease in 1734. But it would be almost 100 years later before another physician in 1803, Thomas Winterbottom, would publish a more thorough report detailing many of the earlier symptoms of the disease. This report was not, however, for the betterment of humanity, as it advised slave traders to avoid acquiring slaves who developed swollen lymph nodes over the back of the neck, a classic early sign of the disease that local slave traders had been watching for hundreds of years. Throughout the 1800s, European scholars became more familiar with the disease, and scientific investigations were published with increasing regularity. The Scottish missionary and explorer David Livingstone was the first since ancient Egyptians to suspect the tsetse fly as being the cause of sleeping sickness in 1852. He suspected this after a herd of cattle he had been moving along the Zambezi River, as well as along several nearby lakes, all fell ill with the disease and died after the herd became inundated with the tsetse flies. It would be almost another half-century, though, before the final piece of the puzzle fell into place, when Scottish microbiologist David Bruce discovered Trypanosoma brucei as the causative agent of the disease, at least in cattle. For this discovery, the protozoa was named in his honor. In 1901, a British surgeon, Robert Michael Ford, was examining under the microscope the blood of an ill steamboat captain in Gambia when he found an organism that he thought was a worm. It was not until he showed the slides to a colleague Joseph Everett Dutton several months later that he became aware that he was looking at a trypanosome species. Still, the pair did not quite make the connection between the pathogen under their microscope and the sleeping sickness, as the steamboat captain had not yet come down with the classical symptoms. Still, the pair did not quite make the connection between the pathogen under their microscope and the sleeping sickness, as the steamboat captain had not yet come down with the classical symptoms when he was examined by Ford. Just months later, though, an Italian physician, Aldo Castellani, would find Trypanosoma brucei in the cerebrospinal fluid of a sleeping sickness patient and conclude that this protozoa was indeed the causative agent. Almost immediately after this publication, David Bruce, the person who had discovered Trypanosoma brucei in the first place, would provide conclusive evidence that the pathogen, and therefore African sleeping sickness, was transmitted by the tsetse fly. This disease, which had caused so much death and suffering in humans and animals alike, but had remained a mystery for thousands of years, had had its secrets completely unraveled in just a matter of months. As it would turn out, all of these discoveries had arisen out of the first well-documented epidemic of sleeping sickness, which occurred from 1896 to 1906. Large outbreaks had, of course, been occurring for as long as humans had been in Africa. But now that Europeans had thoroughly colonized the continent and were concerned for their investments, much more research and documentation was undertaken to control the disease. It should also be pointed out that European colonization almost certainly worsened some of these outbreaks through their often brutal and oppressive rule. This first epidemic, which was centered around Uganda and the Congo, is estimated to have killed between 300,000 and 500,000 people. Now that the disease had finally been identified, colonial administrators were desperate to find a cure. Physicians at the time had only a very limited quantity of effective medications, though, so this was quite the tall order. The first medication, if you could call it that they attempted to use was a derivative of arsenic, sodium arsenate. Researchers found it to be effective in animals and soon moved on to other arsenic compounds as well. A new arsenic derivative had recently come to market, atoxyl, which got its name because it was supposedly atoxic or non-toxic to humans. However, when famed German physician Robert Koch attempted to use the drug on 1,600 infected patients in an outbreak in Uganda, he discovered just how false the atoxyl name was after 22 of his patients went completely blind from the treatment. Koch told one of his colleagues, Paul Ehrlich, about the complications of the treatment and asked if he could improve upon the drug. At the time, chemical manufacturing heavily revolved around the production of dyes, and finding alternate uses for some of the compounds produced in these dye factories was a very profitable, and therefore quite popular, field of study. One of the dyes that Ehrlich experimented with was tryptan red, and it appeared to be curative of the disease in certain animals. Sadly, though, it was not effective against the specific species of Trypanosoma which infects humans. Eventually, though, one of Ehrlich's assistants, Wilhelm Holl, would, in 1916, develop the first truly effective treatment for sleeping sickness, Bayer 205, which was later named Suramin. While it is only really effective in the early stages of sleeping sickness, it is amazingly still in use today, over 100 years later. At nearly the same time, another team, led by a pair of American researchers, Walter Jacobs and Michael Heidelberger, found another arsenic compound that was effective against the microbe, which they coined organic arsenical trypanosamide, which was effective, although not perfect, for the treatment of later stage sleeping sickness. When a second large epidemic of sleeping sickness erupted in several African countries in the 1920s, these drugs were put to great use. Like many, if not most, infectious diseases of the 20th century, however, it was not miracle cures that finally decreased the prevalence of sleeping sickness. While we like to think of scientists in the lab who come up with an amazing aha moment and suddenly rid the world of a disease with their new and amazing medicine, it is, in reality, often much less glamorous work typically in the field of public health and prevention, which really reduces the rates of disease. It was a French military surgeon by the name of Eugène Jameau who first proposed the use of mobile teams which could be dispatched to the site of an outbreak where they could hunt down and aggressively eliminate reservoirs of the disease, namely the breeding grounds for the tsetse flies. After years of opposition from his superiors, though, Jameau was finally allowed to test his theory by establishing a mobile team in Cameroon in 1926. His efforts proved extraordinarily effective, nearly halting a devastating outbreak occurring in the country at the time. Other countries adopted similar, although somewhat modified strategies, which were also effective, although none were successful at completely eliminating the tsetse fly. Over the coming years, several groups would attempt to develop a drug which was superior to the arsenic compound that was in popular use at the time for later stage sleeping sickness. In 1937, a chemist by the name of Arthur James Ewens would develop pentamidine. Though not effective with late-stage illness, it was still quite useful for earlier manifestations. Amazingly similar to Suramin, this drug is still routinely used for the treatment of sleeping sickness. Still, nobody was able to effectively treat patients after they had already started developing neurological symptoms. This would change, though, in 1949, when a Swiss microbiologist and chemist, Ernst Friedheim, would develop another arsenic compound, melarsoprol, which was the first effective treatment for late-stage sleeping sickness. By the early 1960s, rates of death from sleeping sickness had declined massively compared to just 30 years earlier, due to both effective treatments as well as large-scale public health measures. By the mid to late 1960s, though, decolonization of the continent had led to loss of much of the public health and medical support provided by the European countries. Additionally, the power gap left by the Europeans led to severe political instability and economic collapse in many areas. As sleeping sickness had been well controlled for the last decade, expensive efforts to keep the tsetse population suppressed were of low priority for the newly independent governments. Additionally, DDT, which had been in use for decades to control insect populations, was banned worldwide in the 1970s due to concerns over its environmental toxicity. All of these conditions led to a reemergence of the disease, which kicked off a decades-long rise in the rates of sleeping sickness. So where does that leave us now? At the turn of the millennium, sleeping sickness was occurring at rates almost as high as what had been observed 100 years prior. Making the matter worse, a newer drug, eflornithine, had been developed in 1990 to replace melarsoprol as the only effective treatment for late-stage sleeping sickness, only for this new and improved drug to be discontinued in 1995, as unfortunately its primary market was African nations, where it did not make a profit. At the time, even melarsoprol was under serious threat of being discontinued for the same reason. Fortunately, though, an agreement was reached between the World Health Organization and the pharmaceutical companies who make these drugs in 2001, which restarted the production of eflornithine and ensured that melarsoprol remained in production. Since then, the Organization of African Unity has launched a new initiative, the Pan-African Tsetse and Trypanosomiasis Eradication Campaign, which plans to use 21st century methods to reduce rates of sleeping sickness. One of the more interesting of these methods has been the sterile male technique, a strategy in which large numbers of sterilized male tsetse flies are released into the environment. Female flies then mate with these instead of the wild males, thereby drastically reducing the birth rate of new flies. While this method, as well as several others, such as the use of modern insecticides and bait traps, have run into several substantial challenges with funding, they have shown to be somewhat successful, with rates of new disease declining nearly every year since 2000. Still, it's important to remember the lessons of the past and not let our guard down. Trypanosoma brucei was here long before us, and it will likely still be here long after we're gone.